Did you know that before the Civil War, America had more than 1,000 different currencies in circulation? It sounds like a tall tale, but it's true. In the mid 19th century, every banknote in your pocket came from a different bank, each bill a unique design, a unique promise of value. Walk into a store in those days, and the money you carried might buy you what you need, or it might be refused as worthless paper. It was a financial Wild West, full of chaos and opportunity, where fortunes could vanish overnight with the collapse of a distant bank. For ordinary Americans, this meant living with uncertainty every day, never entirely sure if the cash in hand was solid gold or just worthless paper. This is the story of how that chaos came to be and the fierce battle over banking power that shaped a nation. In the early days of America, money was a motley assortment of coins and paper. British pounds, Spanish silver dollars, and homemade colonial notes all jangled together in colonial purses. Each colony printed its own currency, often with grand promises emblazoned on the bills, promises that sometimes collapsed in spectacular fashion. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued paper money to fund the fight, only to see it turn to useless confetti. The phrase "not worth a continental" became a grim joke, a reminder that unchecked paper money could betray the people's trust. Memories of economic turmoil and the anguish of soldiers and farmers paid in nearly worthless currency ran deep. In fact, an earlier attempt at a central bank, the Bank of North America, chartered by Congress in 1781, had met a chilly reception. Public wariness of that Philadelphia-based institution led Pennsylvania to strip it of certain privileges after the Revolution, underscoring Americans' instinctive distrust of concentrated financial authority. By the 1780s, bitter experience had planted a deep suspicion of centralized power in American hearts, especially when it came to money. Having thrown off a king's rule, the young United States was wary of any new tyrant, whether on a throne or behind a bank's desk. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no national currency at all. Each state chartered its own banks and printed its own dollars, leading to a patchwork of currencies that rarely held their value beyond state lines. Trade was cumbersome, and confidence in paper money was scarce. Farmers and merchants often found themselves at the mercy of distant legislatures and bankers. One year, their pockets might be bulging with paper notes. The next year, those notes might be worthless. Many Americans clung to gold and silver coins, heavy, hard money, as the only reliable tender in a world of fleeting paper promises. In 1786, hundreds of desperate farmers in Massachusetts, crushed by debts and a shortage of hard coin, rose up in protest. This uprising, Shays' Rebellion, saw armed men closing courts to halt farm foreclosures. Though quashed, it sent a shiver through the country's leaders, underscoring the perilous state of the young nation's finances and the potential for chaos. But even as many citizens distrusted centralized authority, others saw an urgent need for unity and order. The new nation was drowning in war debt and economic disarray. Without a stable financial system, how could the United States survive in a world dominated by powerful European economies? Into this fray stepped an unlikely visionary, Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton looked at the chaos and saw an opportunity to bind the states together under a strong financial framework. He dreamed of a modern nation fueled by commerce and credit, with a national bank at its core. Hamilton himself was a self-made man, an immigrant orphan turned Revolutionary War hero, and he believed that a robust banking system was the key to America's future prosperity and security. At the same time, an opposing voice rose in defiance. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, champion of the agrarian farmer and the local community. Jefferson believed true liberty thrived not in banks or cities, but in fields and small towns, far from the influence of financiers. To him, Hamilton's proposed national bank was a menace, a centralization of wealth and power that could invite corruption and tyranny. As Jefferson would famously write, banking institutions were more dangerous to American liberty than standing armies. He warned that entrusting power to a central bank was no different than surrendering to the monarchs of Europe. He, along with his ally James Madison, argued that the Constitution did not authorize such a bank, and that it would only favor Northern merchants and wealthy investors at the expense of Southern planters and the common folk. Madison, then a congressman, feared the bank would create a moneyed interest that could dominate government. The debate raged in the halls of the new federal government and in the newspapers of the day. President George Washington, uncertain and seeking guidance, asked his cabinet for written opinions. Hamilton produced a thorough report justifying the bank as necessary and proper for carrying out the government's powers. Jefferson countered with a strict interpretation of the Constitution, insisting that no such power existed. In early 1791, after fierce arguments in Congress, Hamilton's bank bill passed by a narrow margin. Washington hesitated, wary of overstepping constitutional bounds. But after deliberation, he sided with Hamilton's reasoning. In February 1791, he signed the bill creating the first Bank of the United States. This outcome was greased by political compromise. Reluctant Southern lawmakers had agreed to support Hamilton's financial plan, including the bank, in exchange for moving the new national capital to the banks of the Potomac River, the future Washington, D.C. It was a watershed moment, the boldest step yet towards centralizing economic power in America. The bank opened its doors in Philadelphia later that year, and almost immediately, the nation got a taste of speculative frenzy. The sale of the bank's stock in July 1791 triggered one of America's first stock market bubbles. Crowds of investors, from gentlemen to grocers, scrambled to buy bank scrip, subscription certificates. Within weeks, the value of those shares soared to astronomical heights, then suddenly crashed, ruining many latecomers. This wild episode, and the minor panic of 1792 that followed, foreshadowed the nation's future love-hate relationship with high finance. Yet even in victory, Hamilton's triumph was not absolute. The charter of the bank was limited to 20 years, a compromise with skeptics who wondered what might happen if this experiment went awry. And indeed, the skepticism persisted. As the first bank settled into its role, establishing branches in cities from Boston to Charleston, many patriotic Americans remained deeply uneasy. In taverns and town squares, they asked one another whether this new money power was a blessing or a curse. The struggle of ideas between centralized authority and local control, between the few and the many, was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. In its 2 decades of life, the First Bank of the United States brought a measure of order to the young nation's chaotic finances. Opened in 1791 with great fanfare, the bank set up headquarters in Philadelphia, then the bustling commercial heart of America, and soon established branch offices from Boston to New Orleans. For the first time, Americans had something approaching a uniform national currency. The bank's own paper notes, backed by substantial capital and the credit of the U.S. government, gained wide acceptance from New England to the frontier. Merchants no longer had to weigh and scrutinize dozens of different state bank notes for each transaction. A Bank of the United States note was as good as gold across the country. The bank also provided the federal government with a secure place to deposit revenues and a reliable source of loans. Tax collections, which had been haphazard, now flowed into a central vault, and the nation's war debt began to be repaid under Hamilton's watchful eye. The bank even managed the government's payments to European creditors, enhancing the young nation's financial reputation abroad. Success, however, came with controversy. Many state bankers and local politicians resented the first bank's dominance and the way it checked their own financial freedom. It was the largest corporation in America, a colossus with $10 million in capital, an almost unthinkable sum at the time, and it drew the envy and mistrust of those who feared power concentrated in any one institution. Critics whispered that it was an elite club, serving wealthy investors and foreign interests at the expense of ordinary citizens. In fact, foreigners had purchased a significant portion of the bank's stock, though by law, foreign shareholders could not vote their shares. To a nation freshly rid of British rule, the idea of European aristocrats profiting from America's bank was a bitter pill to swallow. Small farmers and businessmen complained that the bank's concentrated financial clout allowed it to dictate credit terms. If the national bank tightened lending or demanded hard coin for its notes, businesses in far-off towns could fail overnight. Every time the bank flexed its muscles by pressuring weaker state banks to redeem their notes in gold, for example, it reminded Americans that financial power had shifted to a distant institution in Philadelphia. To the bank's defenders, such oversight prevented reckless banking and kept the currency sound. To its enemies, it felt like meddling by a moneyed monopoly. Through the 1790s, the first bank generally fulfilled Hamilton's hopes. It stabilized the currency and brought a new level of financial discipline to the young republic. The U.S. economy grew. By facilitating loans to businesses and regulating the flow of money, the bank helped the nation prosper. But political winds were shifting. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson, long an opponent of the bank, was elected president. His party, the Democratic Republicans, gained control of Congress. These populist champions of the yeoman farmer had never trusted Hamilton's creation. They saw the first bank's expiration date of 1811 as an opportunity to return banking power to the states and the people. As that deadline approached, a fierce debate erupted once more in the halls of Congress. On one side, supporters of the bank, now including some moderate Republicans as well as the remaining Federalists, argued that the bank had been invaluable. They pointed to the nation's improved finances and warned that dismantling it could bring back the monetary chaos of earlier days. On the other side, die-hard opponents were resolute that the charter must end. The argument was not just economic, but deeply ideological, a trial of strength between the vision of a consolidated financial system and the ideal of broad local autonomy. Speeches thundered in Congress. Senator Henry Clay, once a friend of the bank, turned against it and railed that it was a corrupt monopoly. Young Congressman Daniel Webster, meanwhile, rose to defend the bank, extolling its stabilizing influence. Petitions from merchants poured in urging renewal, while agrarian voices insisted the bank was an unconstitutional tool of aristocracy. After weeks of debate, the vote finally came in early 1811. It was nail-bitingly close. In the House of Representatives, the recharter bill failed by a single vote. In the Senate, the tally was a tie until Vice President George Clinton, an old anti-bank stalwart, cast the deciding vote against renewal. The first bank of the United States was living on borrowed time. When the charter officially expired in 1811, the bank closed its doors for good. Its elegant columned building in Philadelphia fell silent, and its notes gradually disappeared from circulation. Proponents of free banking rejoiced. One Virginia congressman toasted the bank's demise as a victory for liberty. But that celebration would prove painfully short-lived. Within a year, the United States found itself at war once again, this time with Great Britain in the War of 1812, and the timing could not have been worse. Deprived of its central bank, the federal government struggled mightily to finance the war effort. Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin attempted to float loans to fund military operations, but without the bank's nationwide network, it was slow and difficult. Many New England banks, whose Federalist owners opposed the war, flatly refused to lend money to the federal government at all. The government's credit sputtered. Soon, the Treasury was virtually broke. Government bonds that had once been issued at par could find few buyers, except at deep discounts, and only the patriotic or foolhardy would accept the government's paper money. By war's end, the United States verged on insolvency. As British troops advanced in 1814, even burning the Capitol and the Treasury in Washington, the country's financial structure all but collapsed. Dozens of state-chartered banks, freed from the restraint that the first bank had provided, began printing and lending money with abandon to support the war or to speculate on the opportunities it created. Inflation surged as the real value of paper money plummeted. By late 1814, banks across the nation, except in New England, suspended the conversion of their notes into gold or silver. Soldiers and suppliers to the army found themselves paid in hastily printed government IOUs and assorted banknotes that in many cases traded at only a portion of their face value. The young nation's currency fractured once more, a bewildering mix of depreciated banknotes and government treasury notes, essentially federal. IOUs circulated at varying discounts. Financially, the United States was nearly as unmoored as it had been in the 1780s. The aftermath of the war brought a sober realization. Even James Madison, the president who had once helped Jefferson oppose the first bank, had seen enough. The lessons were brutal, but clear. Without some central coordinating financial institution, the government's ability to wage war and support the economy was gravely hindered. In 1816, Madison signed into law a charter for a second bank of the United States. It was a stunning reversal of fortune for the idea of a national bank. The very politicians who had cheered the first bank's demise now conceded that a central bank was necessary to restore stability and credit. America would get another chance at a national bank to bring order back to its currency and finances. But as the nation was about to discover, the battle over banking power was far from settled. The second bank would soon face an even more ferocious challenge from a new champion of the people, a president named Andrew Jackson, who loathed the bank with every fiber of his being. The Second Bank of the United States began operations in 1816, but its start was rocky. Eager to spur the post-war economy, the bank's early directors lent freely, flooding the country with credit and speculation. Land prices skyrocketed. Easy money fueled a bubble of wild investment. But the bubble soon burst. In 1819, the bank abruptly tightened lending to curb inflation and protect its reserves, an action that helped trigger America's first major financial panic. Banks failed by the dozens, mortgages were foreclosed, and unemployment swept the country. To those ruined in the panic of 1819, the new Bank of the United States became a villain overnight, a monster, they called it, that had callously snatched away prosperity. In the West and South, farmers cursed the bank for calling in loans and demanding hard coin, actions they believed had crushed small debtors under its heel. Several states even tried to fight back. In Maryland, the legislature imposed a punitive tax on the bank's Baltimore branch, hoping to drive it out of business. The bank sued, and in 1819, the case went to the Supreme Court. There, Chief Justice John Marshall upheld the bank's legality in the landmark McCulloch versus Maryland decision, famously declaring that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, and thus a state could not tax an instrument of the federal government. The second bank was constitutionally vindicated, but the court's ruling did nothing to soothe public resentment. If anything, it confirmed the worst fears of states' rights advocates, that a powerful financial leviathan, backed by federal authority, could ride roughshod over local interests. In time, the second bank moderated its policies and learned caution. Under the leadership of a bright Philadelphia banker named Nicholas Biddle, who became bank president in 1823, it stabilized the economy through the 1820s. The bank grew to have immense influence. It regulated the nation's money supply by demanding accountability from smaller banks and curbing their excesses. Prosperity slowly returned. By the end of that decade, the United States was in a period of expansion again. But the bitter memories of 1819 had not faded. especially on the frontier. Many Western and Southern farmers remained deeply skeptical of the bank, seeing it as an Eastern elite institution that meddled in local credit and favored big businesses over the common man. Several state legislatures passed resolutions condemning the bank. It became a convenient scapegoat for any hard times. And in 1828, the common man's champion ascended to the White House, carrying with him a burning determination to slay this financial dragon. His name was Andrew Jackson. A former general and a hero of the War of 1812, Jackson personified the raw spirit of the American frontier. Tough, independent, brashly democratic, and fiercely suspicious of anything that smelled of privilege. To Jackson, the Second Bank of the United States was more than just a financial institution. It was an enemy of the people. He had personally suffered from speculative ventures in his younger days and developed a deep aversion to paper money and debt. He preferred hard currency, gold and silver coin, as the only safe and honest money. As president, Jackson made it no secret that he wanted to destroy the bank. He saw in it the same kind of concentrated power that Americans had fought against in the Revolution. Only now the tyrant wore a banker's coat. He took to referring to the bank as a monster and its executives as an unelected cabal of financiers oppressing the average American. Nicholas Biddle, the bank's urbane and educated president, watched Jackson's rise with growing alarm. Biddle believed wholeheartedly in the bank's mission and knew it was popular in many business circles. Initially, he was confident he could reason with the administration or outmaneuver Jackson's hostility. As Jackson's first term progressed, Biddle worked quietly to build support in Congress for the bank's recharter well ahead of the 1836 expiration. Urged by leading pro-bank legislators like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, Biddle made a fateful decision. He would push Congress to renew the bank's charter in 1832, 4 years early, turning it into a political showdown. The calculation was that Jackson, facing re-election, might not dare veto such an important institution and risk the public's wrath. If he did veto it, Clay, who was running against Jackson, hoped the president's action would alienate voters. Jackson, however, was not one to shrink from a fight. In July 1832, he vetoed the recharter bill with a blistering message that laid bare his populist creed. He thundered that the bank was unconstitutional, subversive of the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. It concentrated undue economic power in the hands of a privileged few. It is to be regretted, Jackson wrote in his veto, that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. This declaration rang out as a rallying cry for ordinary Americans. Jackson cast himself as the defender of humble citizens, farmers, mechanics, and laborers, against a distant, wealthy elite. The bank's charter, he insisted, granted unfair advantages to stockholders, including foreign investors, at the expense of the common folk. Why should a small group of wealthy individuals, he argued, have control over the nation's currency? Therefore, with dramatic flourish, he struck the bill down. The 1832 presidential election became a direct referendum on the bank's fate. Biddle and his allies poured resources into supporting Jackson's opponent, Henry Clay, and the air rang with heated rhetoric. But Jackson's veto had touched a deep chord of democratic distrust toward financial elites. At rallies, throngs of Jackson's supporters cheered the veto as if celebrating a military victory. In newspapers, pro-Jackson editors defended the decision in fiery editorials, praising Old Hickory for standing up to the money power. When the votes were tallied, Jackson won re-election in a landslide. His triumph was not just personal. It was interpreted as a mandate from the people to destroy the bank once and for all. Jackson wasted no time. Interpreting his victory as approval to proceed, he devised a plan to bleed the second bank to death before its charter ran out. In 1833, he ordered the Secretary of the Treasury, to remove federal government deposits from the bank's vaults and redistribute them to various state-chartered banks across the country. Critics would soon dub them pet banks for their loyalty to Jackson's party. This was an unprecedented executive maneuver. The bank depended on those hefty federal deposits as its financial cornerstone. Without them, it would be gravely weakened. Jackson's own cabinet was uneasy about such a drastic step. His first Treasury Secretary refused to carry out the order and resigned. Jackson fired his second for hesitating. Finally, he found a willing lieutenant in Attorney General Roger B. Taney, whom he promptly appointed as Treasury Secretary to do the deed. By late 1833, millions of federal dollars were being pulled out in tranches and placed in selected state banks. Biddle was aghast and furious at this frontal assault. The bank war, as newspapers called it, escalated into a full-blown conflict between the nation's most powerful man and its mightiest financial institution. Biddle fought back with the only weapons he had: economic leverage. He curbed new loans and demanded repayment on existing loans from businesses and state banks, deliberately contracting the money supply. His intent was to create a mild panic, enough to demonstrate the bank's importance by triggering complaints nationwide of a credit crunch. Nothing but the evidence of suffering will produce any effect on Congress, Biddle wrote, acknowledging his harsh strategy. Soon enough, businesses began to writhe under the pressure. Interest rates rose and credit dried up. By early 1834, small factories were closing and workers were being laid off. Newspapers that had been friendly to the bank printed dire stories of a looming depression, and they laid the blame at Jackson's feet. But Jackson, stubborn and steely, refused to back down. He believed Biddle was essentially staging economic blackmail to extort a recharter, and the president declared he would not be cowed by the monster. The political battle intensified. In the Senate, Henry Clay and his allies formally censured Jackson in March 1834 for what they termed an abuse of power, the first time a president had been censured by Congress. Jackson, outraged but unbowed, insisted he was defending democracy against a financial oligarchy. He would later have the Senate's censure expunged from the record once his supporters regained control. The public, meanwhile, was divided. Some merchants and bankers sided with Biddle, terrified that Jackson's crusade was destabilizing the economy. But many farmers and workers stood by the president, seeing in the tightening credit a vindication of their suspicions about the bank's ability to harm everyday folks. By 1836, the Second Bank of the United States was effectively doomed. Its federal charter expired that year, and thanks to Jackson's maneuvering, it was not renewed. Biddle managed to obtain a Pennsylvania state charter to continue the bank as a private institution, renamed the Bank of the United States of America, Pennsylvania, and for a brief time it carried on. But without the federal government's backing and its privileged status, the institution was but a shadow of its former self. In the ensuing years, Biddle's state bank ventured into risky speculation and eventually collapsed in 1841, unleashing scandal and lawsuits. Jackson had gotten exactly what he wanted. The monster was slain. A triumphant Jackson even received an honorary gold medal from admirers, engraved with the motto, "I killed the bank." In 1837, shortly before leaving office, his allies in the Senate finally succeeded in expunging the old censure from the records, literally striking the condemnation from the Senate Journal. Jackson celebrated with a lavish dinner, a final toast to his victory over the bank. But the end of the bank brought new problems. In the aftermath of the bank's demise, a flood of largely unregulated state banks, flush with the federal deposits and freed from many restraints, pumped credit into the economy. Easy money fueled a frenzy of land buying, speculation, and get-rich-quick schemes. A speculative bubble inflated to dangerous proportions by 1836. Jackson himself grew alarmed at the mania. Hoping to rein it in, he issued the Specie Circular in July 1836, an executive order that required Western lands to be purchased only with gold or silver. The sudden demand for hard coin popped the speculative bubble. The party ended with a crash. In 1837, the country plunged into one of its worst financial depressions to date, the Panic of 1837. Banks failed in waves, unemployment spiked, and riots for food broke out in some eastern cities. Jackson's critics argued that in destroying the bank, he had also destroyed the economy's safety net. The Panic of 1837 ushered in years of economic misery, and it fell to Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, to grapple with the fallout. Van Buren, following Jackson's hard money philosophy, refused to consider reviving a central bank. Instead, he pushed for an independent treasury system, a network of government vaults that would hold federal funds in hard specie, separated from the private banking system. This independent treasury was established in 1840, and after a brief repeal, reinstated in 1846, providing a measure of stability but doing little to spur growth. Meanwhile, proponents of centralized banking did not give up. The Whig Party, inheritors of Hamilton's vision, tried to charter a new national bank in 1841 when they briefly controlled government. But President John Tyler, a former Democrat who opposed the idea, vetoed it. The country would remain without a true central bank for the rest of the 19th century. Thus, Jackson won the war he had waged. But his victory came at a price the nation would continue to pay in instability. The United States entered the 1840s with no central bank and a banking system in the hands of myriad state institutions. The question of how to ensure financial stability while preserving the liberties Americans held dear was left to the future. It would return with a vengeance in the decades ahead, as the nation hurtled toward even greater convulsions. With Andrew Jackson's defeat of the Second Bank, America entered an era of freewheeling, decentralized banking. From 1837 until the Civil War, there was no national bank at all, only state-chartered banks, and even a few unchartered free banks, each issuing its own paper money. This period came to be known as the free banking era, and it was as colorful as it was chaotic. By 1860, nearly 1,600 state banks were in operation, each churning out unique banknotes. All told, Americans might encounter more than 10,000 different designs of paper money in circulation, ornately printed bills depicting everything from railroads to farm animals, depending on the bank. Hundreds upon hundreds of new banks sprouted across the country in these years, from the big port cities of the East to raw frontier towns in the West. Anyone with enough capital, and sometimes with barely any real capital at all, could open a bank, print their own banknotes, and start lending. In theory, these notes were redeemable for gold or silver at the issuing bank's counter. In practice, redemption was often difficult or downright impossible, especially if the bank was a flimsy operation set up in some far-off wilderness or above a village general store, far from where its notes actually circulated. Without a central authority, the quality and reliability of banknotes varied wildly. Some banks were honestly run and tried to keep enough coin on hand to back their notes. Others, the notorious Wildcat banks, were little more than frauds. Legend has it that certain cunning bankers established their offices in remote areas infested with wildcats, so that note holders would have to trek miles through forests to redeem their currency. Whether true or not, the name stuck. These wildcat banks issued fancy-looking currency that often wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. One famous tale from Michigan tells of bank inspectors arriving to verify a new bank's reserves. The bankers proudly presented boxes that appeared to be filled with silver coins, only for the regulators to dig beneath the top layer and find nothing but nails and broken glass underneath. Such brazen trickery was not uncommon in the feverish climate of the time. Bank failures became a regular occurrence. It was not unusual for a community to wake up and find its local bank shuttered and its banknotes suddenly worthless, leaving farmers and shopkeepers holding the bag. Even when banks were operating in good faith, their notes carried a geographic risk. The farther from its source a banknote traveled, the less it was trusted. A $5 bill from a reputable bank in Ohio might be accepted at face value in Columbus, But if one carried it to New York or Louisiana, merchants there might only take it at a heavy discount or refuse it entirely, unsure if that distant Ohio bank was solvent or even real. To navigate this bewildering landscape of money, Americans relied on banknote reporters. One can picture a dry goods store clerk in 1855, ledger in one hand and dough-geared reporter in the other, carefully checking each strange bill a frontier farmer offers in payment, while the nervous customer waits to learn if her hard-earned notes will be accepted or declined. These thick, regularly updated guides listed every known banknote and quoted what discount or haircut it traded for in major cities. Shopkeepers kept them behind the counter, thumbing through pages to check how much a Tennessee dollar or an Illinois dollar was really worth today. Counterfeiters also had a field day. With so many designs and no centralized oversight, forging banknotes became a lucrative criminal profession. By the 1860s, it was estimated that as much as one-third of all currency in circulation was counterfeit. Imagine the uncertainty this bred. Every cash transaction was shadowed by doubt. Was that bill genuine? Would it be honored? The United States was a nation of many monies, and confidence was the coin of the realm, a coin in dangerously short supply. Yet the free banking era had its ardent defenders. For champions of local control and free enterprise, this system was the ultimate expression of American individualism and laissez-faire ingenuity. In their eyes, it spread economic opportunity far and wide. Ambitious entrepreneurs in frontier states could start banks to fuel development in their communities without needing permission from distant Washington. State governments experimented with different banking regulations. Some required banks to hold certain reserves or back notes with state bonds. Others, like Iowa and Texas, went so far as to outlaw banks altogether to protect citizens from scams. This patchwork of approaches was messy, but it was born of a philosophy that private competition and local governance would produce the best outcomes. In New England, a coalition of Boston banks created the Suffolk system, an arrangement to redeem rural banknotes at full value in the city, effectively policing the quality of currency in that region. In many places, however, no such system existed, and some areas simply opted out. Both Iowa and Texas wrote state constitutions forbidding banks of issue, an extreme solution to the problem of bad paper money, though one that also starved those economies of credit. Opponents of the freewheeling system, however, argued that the cost of this financial anarchy was far too high. They saw the Wildcat bank failures, the panics of 1837 and 1857 that sent the economy into tailspins, and the everyday struggles of people trying to figure out the value of their money. To them, the lack of a uniform currency and a central regulator was a recipe for instability that held the nation back. How could a country grow strong when its money was so unreliable? How could commerce thrive when every transaction carried added risk? Critics wrote that the patchwork currency was like having a different language of money in each state, making trade needlessly difficult and dangerous. The debate raged in newspapers and state legislatures. Should America reinstate some form of central bank or continue to trust in the free market chaos? By the late 1850s, the cracks in the free banking system were impossible to ignore. The Panic of 1857 devastated many banks, especially in the Midwest, and deepened calls for reform. And looming on the horizon was an even greater national crisis. The nation was hurtling towards civil war, a conflict that would not only tear the country in two, but also demand resources on an unprecedented scale. In 1861, as cannons began to roar at Fort Sumter, the federal government faced the staggering challenge of financing a war without a stable banking system or uniform currency. It was a turning point. In the midst of the Civil War, Congress finally acted to break the nation's dependence on unstable state bank money. In 1863, it passed the National Bank Act, creating a network of federally chartered national banks authorized to issue a uniform national currency backed by U.S. government bonds. A follow up law in 1865 placed a steep tax on state banknotes, effectively driving those old notes out of circulation. Within a few years, the United States had, at last, a single national currency. The era of wildcat banking was over. The dollar bill carried by Americans from now on would look the same whether one was in Maine or California. But as Americans would learn, centralizing the banking system solved some problems and created new debates. The question at the heart of it all, who should control the power of money, remained. The battle over banking power did not end with the 19th century. It merely evolved. After the turmoil of the Civil War, the United States finally imposed order on its money. A new system of nationally chartered banks and a uniform greenback dollar replaced the old cacophony of currencies. Decades later, in 1913, the pendulum swung decisively towards centralization with the creation of the Federal Reserve System, a central bank at last to oversee the nation's money and credit. And yet, the old debates never truly died. In the end, the question that haunted our forebears still hangs in the air for us. Who should control the power of money? The few or the many? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, it would mean the world to us if you like the video or subscribe to our channel. We truly believe that understanding the past is key to navigating the future. And by studying financial history, you are better prepared to safeguard your wealth than 99% of the people out there. If you have any questions or remarks, or would like to request a video topic for our next deep dive, please leave a comment down below. We aim to reply to all of them. Until next time.